Emmanuel Macron ci ha definiti vomitevoli, cynici, irresponsabili. E qui la stampa italiana a dire, hai visto che ha detto Macron, che siamo irresponsabili.
Today, we're going deep into one of the biggest and most surprising shifts inside the EU, the rapidly evolving relationship between Italy's Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni and France's President Emmanuel Macron, and how their political dance is reshaping the future of Europe. So sit tight, because this story has rivalry, alliance, diplomacy, strategy, and huge consequences for the European Union and the world. Over the past months, Europe has been pushed into a moment of extreme pressure. The war in Ukraine continues to drain resources, test unity, and challenge global diplomacy. At the same time, the EU is facing an internal storm: disagreements over frozen Russian assets, arguments over how to fund Ukraine, questions about defense spending, and ideological battles between nationalist governments and pro-integration governments. And at the center of all this chaos stands two major leaders with completely different political identities, Meloni and Macron, suddenly finding themselves forced into cooperation. Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel, and before we dive into today's powerful breakdown of Europe's political storm, make sure you subscribe to EU Politics, because what's happening right now across the European Union is not just news, it's history in motion. To understand how shocking this cooperation is, we need to remember where things stood not so long ago. Giorgia Meloni rose to power as a right-wing nationalist, skeptical of deep EU integration, suspicious of elite Brussels influence, and determined to put Italy's sovereignty first. Emmanuel Macron, on the other hand, has been Europe's loudest voice for deeper integration, EU-wide defense strategies, centralized fiscal tools, and a more unified European political identity. For years, the two leaders clashed publicly. The French government criticized Italy's approach to migration. Italy accused France of hypocrisy and called out its old colonial attitudes. Macron spoke in favor of a strong European centre. Meloni spoke about protecting national borders and national culture. Their political philosophies were almost perfectly opposite, and yet today, the political landscape has forced them into something closer to cooperation, even partnership. This isn't because they suddenly agree. It's because Europe is being pulled by forces bigger than any single ideology. The Ukraine war has drained national budgets and forced governments to rethink security. Russia's continued aggression has made Europe realize how vulnerable it is when it depends on American protection or fragmented national defense strategies. And the debate over using frozen Russian assets, more than 200 billion euros, has forced leaders to confront the limits of international law and the boundaries of collective action. In this environment, a surprising reset took place. Macron travelled to Rome to meet Meloni in a summit that lasted nearly 3 hours. Reporters described it as warm, constructive, and unusually cooperative. This wasn't a casual photo opportunity. It was a strategic moment where both leaders signalled that they were prepared to put rivalry aside and work together for what they called a stronger Europe. Their joint statements emphasised competitiveness, industrial development, green technology, artificial intelligence, and European strategic autonomy. They made a point to highlight Ukraine, stressing that Europe must expand its defense capacity and cannot rely solely on the United States. But underneath their smiles, the tensions remain real. Meloni still rejects EU plans that could increase national debt, like the proposal to exempt defense spending from EU debt rules. She doesn't want Italy tied into another wave of Brussels-designed financial commitments. Macron, meanwhile, still believes a united defense and financial strategy is the only way Europe can remain relevant on the global stage. Yet both leaders know that Europe is at a crossroads, and neither can afford to be isolated. This is where things get interesting. The European Union is facing one of its most complex legal and financial debates ever: whether to use frozen Russian assets to fund a massive loan for Ukraine. The idea is bold. The EU wants to take profits generated by Russia's frozen central bank funds and channel them into long-term financial support for Kyiv. The logic is simple. Russia caused the destruction, so Russia's money should pay for the reconstruction. But the legal, financial, and strategic risks are enormous. Belgium, which hosts most of the frozen assets, has warned of potential lawsuits and global financial instability. Some European banks fear retaliation, and several governments worry that using sovereign assets could violate international norms. Italy publicly supports helping Ukraine, but it wants guarantees that any action is legally airtight. Meloni has said Italy will not support uncertain or improvised ideas. This again shows her approach: pro-Ukraine but cautious about EU overreach. Macron, however, wants the EU to move fast and act powerfully. He argues that Europe must match US leadership and show that it can defend democracy without hesitation. These competing approaches create the perfect environment for political friction, but also for forced cooperation. In many ways, the EU has no choice but to find compromise. Ukraine desperately needs more funding. Europe cannot afford division at this moment, and the world is watching whether the EU can act decisively or whether internal disagreements will slow it down once again. Inside Italy, Meloni faces her own challenges. The Italian economy has improved in some areas, lower deficit, better employment numbers, more investor confidence, but structural weaknesses remain. Growth is still slow, productivity is low, and bureaucratic delays remain a huge problem. Many business leaders in Italy argue Meloni must push reforms faster. Her critics accuse her of eroding democratic norms, influencing media, and weakening judicial independence. And yet she remains extremely popular among her supporters, who see her as a strong figure defending Italian identity and national interests. This gives her the domestic political strength to negotiate hard in Brussels. Macron, meanwhile, is navigating a divided France, rising protests, a reshuffled government, and an electorate increasingly skeptical of his pro-EU agenda. His attempt to position France as Europe's central leader has met resistance, especially after Germany's recent political turmoil. This makes an alliance with Italy more valuable to him. He needs partners to push his vision of a stronger, more autonomous Europe. So what does this new Meloni-Macron relationship mean for the future of the EU? Many analysts believe it signals a shift away from the old Franco-German axis that dominated European politics for decades. Germany's political instability, economic slowdown, and cautious foreign policy have weakened its influence. France is now looking for new partners. Italy, with its strategic location, large economy, and increasingly assertive government, has become a key player. Meloni's refusal to be categorized not fully Eurosceptic, not fully pro-EU, gives her a unique position. She can negotiate with nationalist governments in Eastern Europe while cooperating with pro-integration leaders in Western Europe. This makes her a bridge and also a wild card. If Meloni and Macron continue to cooperate, Europe may see a new political alignment built not around ideology, but around necessity. War, economic challenges, energy transitions, and global competition from China and the United States are pushing Europe toward greater unity. But nationalist concerns, democratic tensions, and economic inequalities keep pulling it apart. The Meloni-Macron dynamic reflects this exact contradiction. Unity and division, cooperation and competition, all happening simultaneously. The next major test will be the EU summit on Ukraine funding. If Europe agrees on using frozen Russian assets, it will mark a historic moment. The first time sovereign funds from an aggressor state are redirected at this scale for reconstruction and defense. If Europe fails, it risks losing credibility, weakening Ukraine, and giving Moscow a psychological victory. And both Meloni and Macron know their leadership will be judged by what happens next. Beyond Europe, global powers are watching. The United States wants Europe to take more responsibility for its own defense. Russia hopes disagreements inside the EU will delay decisions and weaken support for Ukraine. China is observing how Europe uses financial tools as weapons in geopolitical conflict, because it may affect future sanctions and global financial norms. And developing countries are analysing whether Europe can remain stable enough to be a predictable economic and diplomatic partner. This moment is bigger than Meloni or Macron individually. It's about whether Europe can reinvent itself under pressure, whether cooperation can overcome ideology, and whether the EU can adapt to a world that is becoming more unstable, more competitive, and more fragmented. And as all this unfolds, your best source to stay informed is right here. So if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to EU Politics, because what's coming next in Europe will define global politics for years to come. Thank you for watching. Stay informed, and I'll see you in the next one. Inside the EU, a massive debate rages over whether to use more than 200 billion euros in frozen Russian assets to fund a Ukrainian reconstruction loan. Belgium fears legal fallout. Italy demands legal certainty. France pushes for bold action.